Over the last couple of years, Bridgerton has become one of my favourite ongoing shows, and I think that's largely due to the rich setting and the fun cast of characters. This is especially true for our leading love interests. I'm a long-time fan of period romance narratives where there's a large family that each have their own storylines within the overarching tale. Ever since I was a kid, I've been enamoured with them, particularly the likes of Jane Austen's works. I'm talking Pride and Prejudice and also Sense and Sensibility. Those are probably my two favourite ones, and a lot of it has to do with how compelling the leads are. Of course, there's a gulf in difference in tone and content between the Austen verse and what we've seen in Bridgerton, which is obviously far more steamy in nature. I don't think a graphic sex scene between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy is really in the cards in the upcoming Netflix adaptation, after all. Despite these massive differences though, Bridgerton has managed to hook me in that same way, largely due to the eponymous family who serves as the general protagonist of each season, alongside their romantic interest. For me though, this season has taken it to the next level, not only because I think that Sophie's among the most compelling heroines I've seen in quite a while, but also because of the leading Bridgerton of the season, Benedict, who I kind of think has the most compelling story arc that we've seen for all the leads. I feel like this could be a pretty controversial opinion, but just hear me out, okay? I think it's clear at this point that every single season has had its own strengths and weaknesses as we've gone along in the series, and the further along we go, I've been able to put together a little bit of a character ranking, with Benedict currently at the top. That being said, I do acknowledge that a lot of this is going to be subjective, and there really can be no objectivity when it comes to this sort of thing. Everybody's going to be drawn to something different about each season, and something you find insufferable in a character might be the very thing that draws another person to them and makes them their favourite. Even I have my own favourites, and if you've watched my videos before, you'll probably have heard me going on about how I think Anthony Bridgerton is just the best. He for me is very much a core part of the first and second seasons, and to see him gone after that for the most part has been jarring to say the least. However, I'm making an effort in this video to look at things not just from my own personal bias in terms of who my favourite character is, but more about who has the most compelling and satisfying story arc and narrative. When it comes down to it, I really do think that for me, Benedict tops the charts, even if I have never really cared all that much for him until this season. It's really just this first volume that's pulled it all together and managed to really make me understand him on a deeper level than I did before. I will say here, for a bit of a disclaimer, I've not read the books, and so I don't know how the second volume's really going to play out at all. Thus, this has every chance to simply age like milk and make me look like a massive idiot, but that's the risk you run when you make a video like this, I suppose. This brings us to the contest at hand. Who is the best Bridgerton lead? We should probably set up some ground rules before we go any further as to what I'm actually talking about. Seeing as the show is called Bridgerton, we're only going to be looking at leads, as in main season characters that belong to that family specifically. This of course means that we're talking Daphne, Colin, Anthony and Benedict, whilst excluding Simon, Kate, Penelope, Sophie, as well as King George and Queen Charlotte. Not that Simon ever had a chance anyway, but we'll get to that. I've made a whole video about his romance storyline with Daphne and how it really does not hold up, and honestly, that's probably a great place to start. After all, Daphne is in my eyes the worst of the love interests by a considerable margin. Let's not forget that in the first season she rather infamously rapes her husband when she discovers how conception and pregnancy works, and so she forces herself upon him against his objections. I think that alone is enough to turn me off her character. I realise that in the context of the world they live in that it's considered far more of a grey area than that, and in our real world, marital rape is an issue that was only dealt with in a lot of places during the 20th century. Good thing we live in 2026 though, right? Something that was acceptable long ago does not suddenly become acceptable to me now or make it less abhorrent. I utterly reject the notion that you need to put yourself in the time period or in the character's shoes. I am perfectly within my rights to consider characters from older time periods backwards, and I judge and am very suspicious of those that don't do this. For instance, I love medieval fantasy, and something you see crop up again and again is child marriage. However, despite the older party being rather explicitly pedos / child molesters / statutory rapists, people try to whitewash or frame it in a better light. Lots of people did it back then, or it was a different time. Whenever I see that type of thing, it always makes me want law enforcement to check that person's hard drive. Accusations aside though, this isn't the only issue I have with Daphne's storyline or character arc. I also just think that on a rewatch it gives me the ick. A big part of Daphne's storyline is that she's rather naive as a character. Now don't get me wrong, I think you can certainly make a naive character work, but the way it happens is gross. Daphne enters her season with the intention of finding a husband, but is seemingly completely unprepared for her life. Whether that's not knowing a single thing about sex or her body, or just even being the lady of the manor and doing the right thing and what work that entails. Thus she needs to learn from somebody, and that person is Simon. He's very clear from the get-go that he can't marry her because he doesn't want children, although this comes across as he cannot have children, and so Daphne thinks that love will be enough. Whilst after a certain point he does try to keep his distance briefly because of going a bit far and he wants to stop things before it's too late, he eventually just doesn't do that and they hook up, get caught, and have to marry. In my eyes, to a point, he really does take significant advantage of her naivety, and it completely takes me out of the story in that way. And when she does finally get a clue and wise up to the truth, what does she do? The aforementioned sexual assault. That's what. In hindsight, Daphne's story is not one that I'm fond of, and the sweet innocent healing the traumas of the older experienced rake is a dynamic that has since become extremely squeaky for me. I don't know whether they were way more faithful to the books for this story or not, and perhaps they were. Whilst I'm not a reader, I have heard a lot of the characters are way worse in the books, so perhaps that's the writers trying to strike that balance early on and struggling. Early season weirdness is definitely a thing, and this season in particular has aged like milk, as I'm rather fond of saying. To me, all of this really does contribute towards Daphne being the least compelling or interesting character amongst her lead siblings as of right now, and honestly, barring some truly horrific plot development, I don't see how that will ever change. This then brings us to the next character, and I would argue that this siblings arc doesn't upset me in that same way, but it's just extremely bland. We're of course talking about the lead Bridgerton of season 3, Colin. It's a shame because I do rather like Colin for the most part, and I think that he had the makings of a really interesting character. Unlike Daphne, Colin's arc had the benefit of breathing a little bit across the first 2 seasons, before we hit his main storyline. When we meet him, he seems to be an earnest and cheerful young man who's eager for a romantic connection. This eventually leads him into the path of Marina, who he becomes infatuated with, while she's keen to get married straight away because she's actually pregnant with the child of her late lover, boyfriend, something like that. All that is certain is that they weren't married, and her having his child out of wedlock would be a major scandal. Thus, she needs Colin, who's extremely naive and innocent, much like Daphne, I suppose, although in a different way. Despite the protests of some members of his family, such as Anthony, he intends to go through with his plan and marry her until the truth's revealed by Lady Whistledown and he breaks off the engagement. He decides to go away overseas until the next year, with that leading into the second season. When he returns, he's still rather troubled by Marina, and he goes to visit her and her husband, the brother of her late lover. Despite having matured somewhat overseas, he ends up being rather scorned as a little boy, and after telling his lad friends that he would never court Penelope Featherington, off he goes to Europe for another holiday, and when he returns in season 3, he is radically different. Already this was a bit strange as we don't see any of the transformation. He just goes off and is completely different between the seasons with a slight explanation. At least with Pen's glow up, we know how it happened and why it happened, and we in fact saw it happen. She's lonely and wants to be married to somebody so as to not be alone forever, and she uses her own money to revamp her wardrobe because her mother's fashion choices just are not it in any way, shape or form. With Colin though, we get none of that, just dialogue about it, but I always think the best way to get these things across to the audience is to show it, not tell. Here it's all just telling us about how he's different. I think I also just felt that his swashbuckler type vibes were a little bit cringy, so I have no doubt that this also colours my perception of everything going on. In the end, I feel that despite having 2 seasons before his own season to kickstart some storyline, they never really did this. He feels very bland and dull, and for me, Pen and her own story are the far more compelling element, whereas in all the other seasons, everybody sort of holds their own. However, it isn't just his blandness and lacking arc that frustrate me. It's also his actions within the season. For starters, he comes across as a little boy who is angry that somebody wants to play with a toy that he never played with himself. Despite them having chemistry across the seasons and some people picking up on the vibes, Colin remains oblivious to Pen's affections and clearly thinks that courting her is something shameful, hence why he tells his friends at the party he would never do it. The very next season he comes back and Pen asks him for help to attract gentlemanly attention, and when that crashes and burns, she asks him to kiss her so she can at least have that experience. After this, he does start realizing he has proper feelings for her, however she's suddenly being courted by Lord Debling. Uh-oh, now he has competition. Whatever will he do about that? Will he do the mature thing and simply talk to her about his feelings, do a full proper confession? Or instead will he continually crash her conversations, cut in on their dancing, and just be rather rude and tempestuous? He makes a scene more than once and acts like an absolute nuisance, and it comes across as very immature across the board if you ask me. Then when he finally gets the girl, he discovers she's Lady Whistledown and he spends much of Volume 2 having a sook because of that. This further reduces his viability as a compelling romantic protagonist because there's too little actual romance on display and a whole heap of angst. Therefore, I don't think he can really rank all that highly in my little list here. He's just boring in terms of his story and arc with most changes occurring off screen, and then when the romance does kick off, it's almost all angst right until the end. This is a very persistent issue. Part of what actually makes the first season compelling, at least on that first watch, is that it was well structured. They pine and they fall in love, we have brief angst, they marry, they're happy for a time, then there's more angst followed by more happiness. For most of these later couples though, it seems like there's no real progression like this. They have some build and pining, but then a shit ton of angst. Maybe a couple happy scenes peppered in there, but mostly angst. Then there's the resolution at the end, but there's no time to enjoy anything before the season ends. Think about Elizabeth and Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. They meet and it goes very badly, she starts to hate this dude and he starts to pine. She learns a bunch about how he's arrogant and prideful and goes out of his way to damage her sister's happiness when he interferes with her romance with Mr. Bingley. He's painted in the worst light possible by Mr. Wickham, and so when they meet again in Kent and he proposes, he gets rejected, and rejected hard. If this was Bridgerton's later seasons, this would lead to them not seeing each other again until he hears that Lydia ran off, and so he goes out in search of her, he fixes it all, but then he falls off his horse or some shit and gets a tearful confession from Elizabeth on his sickbed, and suddenly they're getting married, and then the story ends. It's not a riveting tale because you never get that catharsis or enough fluff. Good thing that's not the real story. The real story is they both go away and they learn and grow. They let go of their pride and their prejudice, and by doing so, when they meet again in Derbyshire, sparks begin to fly. There's no more personal drama between them, and yet there's still a fair bit of story left to play. She realizes he's truly changed, and thus she begins to soften towards him because of his nature and the revelations of his actions towards Wickham. She bonds with his sister, and then eventually is called away because of the Lydia drama. He goes out of his way to fix things for the family and save their reputation, all because of his love for Elizabeth. She in turn wards off his annoying aunt that comes to try to deny their love, and then they reunite. It's all wholesome and they end up getting married. It is the undisputed GOAT for a reason. I really think that's the issue that Bridgerton often has. The only type of compelling drama they seem to be able to write is one that pits the love interests against each other, and whilst that does work and there is room for it, I also think that Pride and Prejudice proves you can do more than just that. It's often compelling when a couple is forced to face drama together and they persevere. I think that's really why I don't find Colin compelling at all, because after they wed, it could have been a story where he's ride or die for her trying to protect her secret from the Ton and from the Queen. Instead, it's a bit of sulking and a couple of Colin knows best scenes where it all backfires in his face. It just doesn't hit the same level at all. It also doesn't help that post-season he's turned into a massive background character playing happy families with Penelope. I think there was definitely room to add a bit more meat on the bones of their story, and whilst that might happen in Volume 2, I also wouldn't hold my breath by any means. So we're 2 down, and here we come to Anthony. As I said earlier on, Anthony's actually one of my favourite characters, and is probably my favourite amongst the siblings. He's certainly higher on the totem pole than Benedict, that's for sure. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that his love story or his role within it is all that compelling or enjoyable. Actually, scratch that, because I feel that paints the picture that I didn't like his season at all, but that's far from the truth. I really enjoyed season 2, and this list shows that prior to Benedict's first half, I held it in the highest esteem. I still do. I just don't think it really holds that top spot as of right now. I think that part of that, of course, comes from the same place as Colin's story. It's not balanced. There's a huge chunk of extreme tension and pining coupled with angst. This then pivots to pure angst, which in turn lingers throughout much of the latter stage of the story. We see Anthony constantly miserable and making truly terrible selfish choices, and then afterwards, there's no time to really revel in the happy couple. It ends, and then they're barely characters in season 3 at all, and they haven't even appeared in season 4. Once again, they don't balance the character's romantic journey, and so you don't get nearly as much catharsis as you'd want. I also think that his character does come across at points as almost too unlikable, to the point of abject cruelty. Sadly, a big part of the story deals with a love triangle. A love triangle between sisters. Immediately, this should have you shaking your head. He wants a perfect little wife that he doesn't have to actually love, and so he starts to court Edwina, and along the way, he discovers he's vibing with her older sister Kate. They have some insane chemistry, and it's obvious from very early on that this is the case. Instead of doing anything about it, or even just pursuing somebody different, seeing as being avoidant of true love is something that's part of his arc and story, he goes and proposes to the sister, in front of her, getting so far as to arriving at the altar, all the while sharing intense close-up stares. This eventually reveals the truth, and ensures Edwina's complete and utter humiliation within the Ton. Even worse is that he intended to marry Edwina, and that Kate would return to India, presumably never to return, separating these sisters forever for his own convenience. It's really gross and trashy when you think about it like that, right? Already that's one issue I have, that Anthony's role in the romance doesn't quite fit all that well. It doesn't feel right. I actually think Kate's side of things is rather good, all things considered, and fits rather well, in that she had to make herself the head of the family, and is constantly trying to put Edwina before herself, which leads to this disaster. Meanwhile, I just think that Anthony had no real excuse, and it makes his side of the story feel less compelling as a result. However, I also guess that I walked away from Anthony's storyline beyond what I mentioned, feeling like it was a missed opportunity that didn't line up with his overall arc in a satisfying way. I think it's very clear looking back that much like Kate, Anthony's arc is about a man who was forced to grow up and step into his father's place and responsibilities far too soon, and the way this was first unveiled was really interesting. It's almost antagonistic. In season 1, Anthony is honestly a bit of a mess. When we first meet him, he's in the midst of a relationship with an opera singer and is unwilling to marry and move forward with his life. He even considers running away with her at one point if his duel with Simon goes forward and he kills him. However, the big element of the season that sets you up to shake your head at him is the way in which he interacts with his family and tries to act the part of big man on campus. He bosses them around a fair bit in season 1 and mostly comes across as a person who's trying his best, but who is also woefully out of touch with the rest of his family, which leads him to blunder through it all. We see this with his disastrous intervention into Daphne's courtship with Simon, and him bringing that odious Toad Burbrook into things. Then there's his whole whole interaction with Colin, where he's telling him that he shouldn't be getting married so young, and that he should have taken him to brothels once he finished school to ensure he could sow his wild oats. I mean, in the end, he isn't wrong that marrying her would not have been a good idea, but it's simply the way he goes about it. Thus, he comes out of the first season looking like a bit of a fool, but in season 2, it all starts to become clear what the hell's going on. His father died extremely unexpectedly and before his time, which in turn meant he was thrust forward into the position of head of the family. At the same time as this, his mother withdrew and became extremely depressed, which meant he was left to try to steer things alone. Once she returned, I would say that based on the interactions when this happened, he began to receive that unfavorable comparison to his father and was forced to live in his shadow forevermore, competing with his ghost. Seeing as this is a similar vibe to Kate, who wasn't living in her dad's shadow but was forced into that parental/family head role, I figured this would be the main storyline running through it. That the whole reason that he rushes into the relationship with Edwina was because he's utterly traumatized by seeing what losing true love can do to you in the long run, how it can utterly consume you in that way. Thus, instead of the perfect romance, he simply wants the perfect wife that he won't invest into romantically to shield himself from that. The parallels in their story felt like it was building to something a bit bigger than this, and that Anthony's arc in that way would get that catharsis where his whole family, and especially his mum, actually see him, see what he does, and appreciate him in a whole new way. However, instead, he kind of just gets lambasted for his mistakes again and again, and the older members of the family and friend circle try to dig him out of the scandal. They dial the drama up to maximum, and it moves away from what makes Anthony's storyline compelling to begin with. Instead of a story where he realizes that love is worth the risk, and Kate helps him to see his worth, or maybe make the family see his worth, he just blunders around a pointless love triangle that does nothing for anybody's storyline and is insulted at every turn. Yes, eventually there is that scene where he makes peace with his mum, but it just doesn't feel how it should. It doesn't bring that feeling of utter catharsis that should come along with that sort of storyline. Despite those narrative missteps though, his character is compelling enough to bring him into that second place, as he isn't problematic as Daphne or as boring as Colin. This then brings us to Benedict, who as of right now I think is the most compelling of the 4 leads in terms of arc and story. I think part of this comes from the fact that he has 3 seasons beforehand to build him up. When we first meet Benedict, he seems to be a generic second son, not really doing much with his life, although quickly we learn that he has an artistic side, and he opens himself up to that sort of world, including embracing some more rakish tendencies. However, sex aside, the number one thing for him seems to be art, and proving himself to be a good and talented artist. This is where we leave him in season 1, as he isn't a huge character at this point. He gets a girlfriend, and it all seems to be going his way. He's happy. Come season 2, he gets dumped almost immediately, but that's okay because he's trying to get into a proper art school, and he succeeds and does well, until it comes out that Anthony made a generous donation to the school to get him in. Thus, whilst he is talented, at the same time, they would have accepted him even if he had been completely useless. This of course causes him to withdraw from the school and quit painting altogether, because he no longer has the drive and he thinks he was a joke. This in turn leads him into season 3, where he seems to be a lost soul with his only real drive being sex. He realizes he's bisexual, which is good, nice to have some revelations, but of course, his sexuality and sexual escapades is quite legit the only thing he has going on in his life. At the time, I do remember talking in my season 3 videos about how this is just not a compelling story for a character, and that it was worrying that he was entering into his own season undercooked, but I was actually wrong here. Instead, when we picked up the story, they went even further to show the dude's hit rock bottom. Every night's the same. He's drinking and sleeping around and probably doing drugs. He's not engaged with his hobbies, he doesn't engage with society, and he doesn't engage with his family to the point that his mother's clearly concerned. He attends the masquerade ball to please her, and this is where he meets the lady in silver, and immediately is enraptured, and over the course of their conversation and then kiss, he becomes smitten and determined to find her after the ball. Unlike Anthony's story, where they sort of half-assed his personal arc intertwining with the romantic arc, here it seems wholly interconnected. When Benedict first meets Sophie, his world begins to shift again. He becomes more social, he engages more with his family, and he takes up drawing. Try as he might, he can't find her until they have a chance meeting in the countryside where he saves her from some ghoulish acquaintance. Whilst he doesn't know it's the lady in silver consciously, she still has that same effect on him, and he becomes more interested in taking up art or enjoying the smaller things in life like flying a kite. His interactions with her are extremely cute, and I did enjoy that the show acknowledges the power dynamics at hand and how he's playing a dangerous game, with him being very respectful of boundaries. When she rejects him, he accepts it, and when she wants space, he accepts it. I don't think he's overly pushy nor creepy, and indeed, I think it makes his storyline extremely compelling as a result. I actually think they probably have the strongest first half of a season for all the couples so far, even if it is somewhat tainted by this very cringy, embarrassing proposition for her to be his mistress, which in turn will likely lead to even more personal growth. I only hope it doesn't lead to a whole volume's worth of angst, but given that this is a Bridgerton speciality, I suppose I wouldn't be too surprised if that was the case either. I think my major fear is that they spin their wheels and make it seem really shit in the latter half of the volume, which in turn would make this video look like it's aged like milk, as I'm very fond of saying. For now though, I just find his romantic storyline very compelling, and I love how they've wrapped it up so well with his story across these first 3 seasons. It really does seem like a fall and rise type of tale, and thus I'm eager to see where they go from here. Of course, with all that being said, these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. Who is your most compelling lead Bridgerton based on their individual story arc and romance? Do you agree with my order? Maybe you think I'm absolutely delusional. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.